The red-on-air sign glowed like a fresh drop of arterial blood against the peeling wallpaper of the studio corridor. It was 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 1964. Outside, the relentless Pacific Northwest rain hammered against the reinforced glass of the radio station. But inside the soundproof booth of KB-COVE, the world was reduced to an absolute sterile silence. That was the beauty of it. The booth was a sanctuary where chaos was strictly forbidden. Ignacio Vargas leaned into the heavy, chrome-plated RCA microphone. He was a striking man, 34 years old, with the dark, magnetic features of his Mexican heritage and the sharply tailored suits of an East Coast gentleman. His eyes, the color of burnt umber, were half-closed. He didn't just speak into the microphone. He made love to it. "You're listening to KB-COVE, the lone lighthouse in the dark," Ignacio murmured, his voice a rich, velvety baritone that poured out of thousands of vacuum tube radios across the sleeping town of Blythe's Cove. "The storm is howling out there tonight, folks. The wind is tearing at the shingles. The ocean is swallowing the pier. But in here, we have warmth. We have jazz. And we have all the time in the world. So pour yourself another cup of coffee, pull the blanket up to your chin, and let the music wash over you." He reached out with long, elegant fingers and slowly slid a fader up on the massive analog mixing console. The melancholic, smoky notes of a tenor saxophone filled the booth, bleeding seamlessly into his final spoken word. It was a flawless transition, a masterclass in audio engineering. Ignacio sat back in his leather chair and exhaled a long stream of cigarette smoke. He looked across the small, dimly lit room. Sitting on a vinyl couch in the corner was his wife, Blythe. Blythe Vargas looked like the epitome of a quiet, mid-century American housewife. She wore a modest, pale yellow cardigan over a pressed floral dress, her dull blonde hair pinned back perfectly. She was a local girl, a former dental assistant who always spoke in a soft, apologetic whisper. To the town, she was the invisible, supportive shadow behind Ignacio's booming local celebrity. But as Ignacio watched her, the corners of Blythe's pale lips curled into a slow, deeply unsettling smile. She wasn't listening to the saxophone. She was listening to what was hidden underneath it. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back against the heavy acoustic foam that lined the walls. Her fingers, which used to hand Novocaine syringes to a sweating dentist, rhythmically tapped her knee. "Do you hear it, Iggy?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the monitors. "Right there, between the bass notes." Ignacio smiled warmly, a genuine expression of profound affection. He reached over to the heavy Ampex 350 tape machine spinning slowly on his right. The thick, quarter-inch magnetic tape was feeding a secondary audio track directly into the main broadcast mix. "I hear it, my love," Ignacio replied, his voice dropping its radio persona, becoming sharper, colder. 32 hertz. The exact frequency of a failing lung. If a listener in town had a particularly good radio, and if they pressed their ear right up to the warm mesh speaker, they might notice that the vinyl record had an unusual amount of static tonight. A strange rhythmic friction. H-H-H-H-C-K, H-H-H-H-C-K. It sounded like a wet sponge being dragged across a rough stone. It wasn't static. It was a heavily distorted, slowed-down recording of a man suffocating to death. To Ignacio and Blythe, death was the most misunderstood phenomenon in human existence. People died every day. They crashed their heavy steel Chevrolets on Interstate 5. They succumbed to coronaries in their sleep. They drowned in the freezing waters of the cove. And when they died, the world just let the sound of their departure evaporate into the meaningless ether. What a tragic waste of a perfectly good frequency. The final breath, the desperate, panic scratching of the throat, the wet rattle of the vocal cords as the soul was violently evicted from the meat, was the only true, honest sound a human being ever made. Ignacio considered himself an archivist, an artist of the macabre, and Blythe was his muse and his procurer. The audio currently mesmerizing the town of Blythe's Cove belonged to a drifter, a hitchhiker they had picked up 3 days ago. Blythe had been the one to administer the heavy dose of synthetic paralytic, a cocktail she perfected by stealing medical supplies over the years. The beauty of her chemical concoction was that it completely paralyzed the voluntary muscles, including the diaphragm, but left the nervous system and the brain entirely conscious. The victim couldn't blink, couldn't scream, couldn't fight. They could only lie on the cold linoleum floor of the radio station's basement, slowly drowning in their own carbon dioxide, while Ignacio hovered over them with a highly sensitive condenser microphone, capturing every agonizing microscopic vibration. Blythe stood up from the couch and walked over to the thick wall of the studio. She pressed her flat palm against the dark, porous acoustic paneling. It felt cold to the touch. "He was a good one," Blythe whispered, running her nails gently down the fabric of the wall. "He lasted almost 20 minutes. Usually, the heavy ones give out faster." "He had strong lungs," Ignacio agreed, watching the VU meters on the console bounce rhythmically with the dead man's digitized death rattle. "But he serves a better purpose now. The acoustics in here have never been better." Ignacio wasn't lying. The soundproofing in the KB-COVE studio was unparalleled. But it wasn't just the fiberglass foam that absorbed the unwanted echoes. It was a dense, rotting mass packed tightly between the inner drywall and the exterior brick. Blythe patted the wall affectionately, exactly at the spot where the drifter's freshly wrapped corpse had been sealed into the framework just hours before the broadcast. He was the fourth one. The fourth layer of flesh and bone added to their perfect, soundless sanctuary. "They are all listening," Ignacio murmured, leaning back toward the microphone as the jazz track neared its end, preparing to address his oblivious audience once again. "The whole town is digesting his death with their midnight coffee, and they don't even know it." He flicked the microphone switch. The red light flared brighter. That was a little something to keep the chill away. Ignacio's velvet voice purred across the airwaves. "Stay with us, Blythe's Cove. The night is still young, and we have so many more beautiful sounds to share with you." It had started exactly 6 months earlier, on a miserable, rain-swept evening in late April. The coastal highway leading into Blythe's Cove was notorious for washing out during heavy spring squalls, leaving the town essentially cut off from the rest of the Pacific Northwest. Elijah Vance, a 42-year-old traveling life insurance salesman from Seattle, had been driving a battered 1958 Ford Fairlane when his radiator blew a mile down the road from the station. Elijah was a man entirely constructed of defeats. He smelled of stale tobacco, cheap drugstore cologne, and the damp wool of a suit he hadn't taken off in 3 days. Desperate, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, he had trudged up the muddy, winding access road toward the only beacon of light for miles, the towering, red-blinking transmission antenna of KB-COVE. When Elijah pounded his heavy, wet fist against the heavy oak doors of the station's main lobby, he wasn't looking for death. He was looking for a rotary telephone and a cup of hot coffee. Blythe Vargas had opened the door. Back then, she was still working part-time for Dr. Henderson, the town's only dental surgeon, and she had just come up to the station to bring Ignacio his dinner. Standing in the doorway, framed by the warm amber glow of the lobby lamps, Blythe looked like an angel of mercy to the freezing salesman. She offered him a sympathetic smile, a dry towel, and a seat in the station's basement break room while he waited for the storm to pass. "My husband is upstairs, doing the evening news bulletin," Blythe had said, her voice a soothing maternal whisper. "I'll make you some chamomile tea, Mr. Vance. It will warm your bones. The phone lines are down from the wind, but you are safe here." Elijah had thanked her profusely, sinking into a faded armchair, completely oblivious to the predator preparing his drink. In the small kitchenette, Blythe's hands didn't tremble. From the pocket of her cardigan, she retrieved a small glass vial she had stolen from the clinic's locked cabinet that afternoon. It was a highly concentrated liquid derivative of succinylcholine chloride, a powerful neuromuscular blocking agent used to paralyze patients before intubation, mixed with a heavy barbiturate to keep the heart pumping while the lungs forgot how to work. She emptied the entire vial into the steaming cup of tea, stirred in 2 sugar cubes, and carried it out to the salesman on a porcelain saucer. Elijah drank it in 3 greedy gulps. For the first 5 minutes, he talked. He complained about his estranged wife, the crushing quotas of his insurance agency, and the terrible condition of the coastal roads. Blythe just sat across from him, her hands neatly folded in her lap, watching his face with the intense, clinical fascination of a biologist observing a specimen under a microscope. Then, the teacup slipped from Elijah's fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. I feel a little dizzy, Elijah mumbled, his words suddenly slurring as if his tongue had swollen to twice its size. He tried to stand up, planting his hands on the armrest, but his knees buckled instantly. He crashed to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. Panic exploded in Elijah's wide, bloodshot eyes. He tried to scream, to ask what she had done to him, but his vocal cords were already paralyzed. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. He could see, he could hear, he could feel the cold floor against his cheek, but his body was a tomb. The drug was actively shutting down his diaphragm. He was suffocating in the open air. It was at that exact moment that the heavy basement door opened, and Ignacio walked down the stairs. He had finished his broadcast and was coming to eat his dinner. Ignacio stopped in his tracks, his polished leather shoes a few feet away from Elijah's twitching hand. He looked at the dying man on the floor, then slowly looked up at his wife. Blythe didn't offer an excuse. She didn't panic. She simply met his gaze, her chest rising and falling with a strange, dark excitement. A normal man would have run for the telephone. A normal man would have tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But Ignacio Vargas was a man obsessed with the purity of sound. In the suffocating silence of the basement, beneath the drumming rain outside, Ignacio heard it. H-H-H-H-C-K, H-H-H-H-C-K. It was the sound of Elijah's desperate, failing lungs try and pull oxygen through a paralyzed throat. It was a raw, primal rhythm. It was a frequency Ignacio had never encountered before. Without a word, Ignacio turned around and sprinted back up the stairs. He returned less than a minute later carrying his prized possession, a portable military-grade Nagra reel-to-reel tape recorder and a highly sensitive RCA ribbon microphone. Blythe watched in silent awe as her husband dropped to his knees beside the dying salesman. Ignacio didn't look at Elijah's terrified, pleading eyes. He was completely focused on the machine. He threaded the magnetic tape with practiced, lightning-fast precision, hit the record button, and held the silver microphone just 2 inches from Elijah's trembling lips. For 12 excruciating minutes, Ignacio and Blythe sat on the floor, completely silent, recording the agonizing mechanical failure of a human life. Ignacio wore his bulky studio headphones, his eyes closed in pure ecstasy as he listened to the wet, tearing sounds of Elijah's final struggle being permanently etched onto the magnetic tape. When the man's heart finally gave out with a dull, internal shudder, and his bowels released, Ignacio stopped the recording. He slowly pulled the headphones down around his neck and looked at Blythe. His eyes were wide, shining with a dark, feverish revelation. "It's perfect," Ignacio whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's the most honest thing I have ever heard." But then came the practical problem. A 200-pound corpse in their basement. The radio station had been undergoing acoustic renovations. Studio B, a small room at the end of the hall, had its walls stripped down to the wooden studs to install heavy fiberglass soundproofing. Ignacio stared at the deep, dark cavities between the wooden beams. "Human tissue is incredibly dense," Ignacio muttered, almost to himself, calculating the acoustic physics in his head. "Bone, muscle, fat, it absorbs low-frequency sound waves better than any synthetic foam." That night, working side by side in a macabre ballet of sweat and silence, the husband and wife dragged Elijah's stiffening body into Studio B. They bound his limbs tightly with industrial wire, forced him into the narrow gap between the wooden studs, and packed thick rolls of pink fiberglass insulation around his face and torso. Then Blythe held the heavy sheets of drywall in place, while Ignacio nailed them shut, entombing the insurance salesman forever. When they were finished, they stood in the center of the newly sealed room and clapped their hands. There was no echo. The sound was swallowed instantly by the walls. The acoustics were absolutely, terrifyingly flawless. Elijah Vance became the first layer of their masterpiece, and as Ignacio held the spool of magnetic tape in his hands, he knew with absolute certainty that he needed more. The murder of Elijah Vance had been an improvisation, a dark, serendipitous collision, a severe storm, a desperate man, and a stolen medical vial. But over the next 6 months, Ignacio and Blythe Vargas transformed their macabre discovery into a highly disciplined, terrifyingly efficient routine. The walls of KB-COVE were hungry, and Ignacio's ears were starving for new frequencies. By late July of 1964, The suffocating coastal heat had brought their second subject directly to their doorstep. His name was Tommy, a 22-year-old drifter and itinerant auto mechanic who had hitched a ride up the coast from California, looking for work at the local shipyards. Tommy was all grease-stained denim, sunburned shoulders, and restless, youthful energy. He had wandered up the station's access road one sweltering Tuesday afternoon, simply looking for a glass of tap water and directions back to the interstate. Blythe didn't bother with the chamomile tea this time. The tea had been messy. The shattered porcelain cup had required too much scrubbing. She had refined her methodology. While Ignacio kept the young mechanic engaged in a friendly conversation about carburetors in the station's dusty lobby, Blythe approached from behind. She held a preloaded, stainless steel dental syringe concealed perfectly in the folds of her pastel summer dress. The heavy dose of synthetic succinylcholine was injected directly into thick muscle of Tommy's neck before he even knew she was standing there. It was a remarkably intimate act of violence. This time, Blythe didn't just watch from an armchair. As Tommy's nervous system crashed and his strong, grease-stained hands desperately clawed at his own throat, Blythe knelt beside him on the linoleum. She gently stroked his sweaty, sun-bleached hair, her eyes wide with a cold, glittering euphoria. She loved the raw, helpless panic in his eyes. She loved watching the exact moment the realization of death eclipsed his confusion. She traced a rigid, paralyzed line of his jaw while Ignacio, wearing his heavy headphones, hovered inches away with the RCA ribbon microphone, capturing the raspy, what struggle a young, healthy set of lungs fighting a losing war against chemistry. Tommy's death took 24 minutes. His youthful vitality made him fight harder, producing a chaotic, staccato rhythm that Ignacio found absolutely intoxicating. When it was over, Tommy was dragged into Studio A, wrapped tightly in heavy plastic sheeting to prevent the grease and bodily fluids from staining the drywall, and entombed between the oak studs next to the main broadcast booth. Ignacio's collection was growing. In the deepest, windowless corner of the radio station's basement, he had established his library. It was a meticulously organized cabinet of heavy-duty Scotch magnetic recording tape. To the untrained eye, it looked like a standard archive of old radio broadcasts, jingles, and local advertisements. But the labels on the pristine white boxes told a different story. They were categorized not by name, but by acoustic properties. Track 1, Subject A. Elijah, low baritone wet friction, 32 Hz. Track 2, Subject B. Tommy, mid-tenor, erratic spasms, high airflow. Ignacio spent his afternoons at the splicing block, using a razor blade and white splicing tape to cut the physical magnetic ribbons, isolating the most beautiful, haunting gasps. He manipulated the playback speeds on the Ampex machines, stretching a 3-second wheeze into a terrifying 2-minute ambient drone. He began to subtly layer these heavily distorted recordings underneath the jazz and blues tracks he played during his midnight broadcasts. The entire town of Blythe's Cove was listening to the dying breaths of murdered men, perfectly harmonized with the mournful wail of a saxophone, dismissing it as atmospheric radio static. But Ignacio was an artist, and an artist eventually craves a different instrument. He was tired of the rough, unrefined sounds of desperate men. He wanted melody. He wanted a voice trained in the delicate art of breath control. He found her in early September. Clara Higgins was a 55-year-old music teacher and choir director who had recently moved to Blythe's Cove to retire by the ocean. She was a solitary woman, a spinster whose entire life revolved around her beloved piano and her pristine, crystal-clear soprano voice. Ignacio invited her to the station under the guise of recording a special Sunday morning gospel segment. Clara had arrived wearing her Sunday best, a pearl necklace resting against her collarbone, thrilled by the prospect of hearing her own voice on the radio. They placed her in the center of the main isolation booth, surrounded by heavy, perforated acoustic tiles. Blythe, playing the role of the devoted, sweet-natured assistant, brought Clara a glass of room-temperature water to soothe her vocal cords before the recording. The dosage was meticulously calibrated. Clara managed to sing exactly one verse of Amazing Grace before the drug hit her bloodstream. The horror of Clara's death was entirely unique. Because she was a trained vocalist, she instinctively understood how to manipulate her failing diaphragm. Even as the paralysis locked her limbs and sent her crashing to the carpeted floor of the soundproof booth, she fought the suffocation with professional breath control. Her death rattle wasn't a wet, chaotic struggle. It was a high, thin, agonizing whistle. It was a sustained, horrifying note of pure terror pushed through a paralyzed larynx. Ignacio recorded every single second, weeping tears of genuine artistic joy behind the mixing console. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever captured on magnetic tape. When Clara's heart finally stopped, Blythe and Ignacio packed her small, fragile frame into the wall directly behind the mixing desk. The insulation was getting thicker. The acoustics in the station were becoming unnaturally, perfectly dead. 3 bodies, 3 frequencies, sealed forever in the dark. They felt invincible. The police hadn't asked a single question. The town hadn't noticed a thing. Drifters, salesmen, and lonely spinsters vanished all the time. But this dark, intoxicating arrogance was about to blind them, leading them straight toward a fatal, irreversible mistake. Hubris is a quiet poison. It builds up in the bloodstream of the successful, convincing them that they are untouchable, elevated above the messy, unpredictable laws of probability. For Ignacio and Blythe Vargas, their hubris had calcified into a dangerous sense of invincibility. They had successfully vanished 3 people. The walls of KB-COVE were thick, the town was oblivious, and the recordings were flawless. But drifters and lonely spinsters leave no gaping holes in the community. Rosemary Callahan was a different story entirely. Everyone in Blythe's Cove knew Rosie. She was 19 with a bright, infectious laugh and a tireless work ethic. She pulled double shifts at the Rusty Anchor, the local diner, carefully saving every crumpled dollar bill and shiny quarter in a mason jar beneath her bed. She was bound for a teaching college in Seattle the following autumn. She was a town sweetheart, a girl whose absence would be noticed the second she failed to show up for her morning shift. It was late October, a Friday night. The diner had closed, and the coastal fog had rolled in, thick and suffocating. Rosie had offered to run a late-night order of cherry pie and black coffee up to the radio station on her bicycle. Ignacio was a generous tipper, and Rosie never turned down extra college money. She pushed her bicycle up the steep, gravel access road, the paper bag warming her cold hands. When she knocked on the heavy oak doors, Blythe answered, offering her usual warm maternal smile. "Come in, sweetheart. Get out of the damp," Blythe whispered, ushering the girl into the lobby. "Ignacio is just finishing the weather report. I'll get the money from his wallet." Rosie stepped inside, shaking the fog from her hair. She followed Blythe down the carpeted hallway toward the main studio. She didn't notice the strange, heavy silence of the building. She didn't notice Blythe slipping her right hand into the deep pocket of her wool cardigan. Blythe had prepared the syringe earlier that evening, anticipating a different target, perhaps another wandering mechanic. She hadn't adjusted the dosage of the succinylcholine for a young, athletic girl whose bloodstream was currently surging with the adrenaline of a steep uphill bicycle ride. Furthermore, when Blythe lunged to press the needle into the back of Rosie's neck, the girl suddenly turned to look at a framed golden record on the wall. The needle missed a thick muscle, sliding awkwardly into the shoulder before Blythe jammed the plunger down. Only half the paralyzing chemical made it into Rosie's system. It wasn't enough to freeze her. It was only enough to terrify her. Rosie dropped the paper bag. The thermos of coffee shattered, sending a dark, steaming puddle across the linoleum. Her legs immediately gave out, buckling beneath her, but as she hit the floor, her upper body exploded into a frantic, primal survival instinct. "What did you do?" Rosie screamed. It wasn't the beautiful, dying gasp Ignacio craved. It was a raw, deafening shriek of pure panic that tore through the pristine silence of the hallway. Ignacio threw open the studio door, his eyes wide with shock. He was wearing his heavy headphones, clutching his RCA microphone, expecting a paralyzed victim. Instead, he found a bloodbath in the making. Rosie was dragging herself across the floor, her arms thrashing wildly. Blythe, her maternal facade completely shattered, dove onto the girl's back, trying to cover her mouth. Rosie fought like a cornered animal. She swung her elbow backward, connecting violently with Blythe's face. The impact was sickening. Rosie's fingernails raked deeply across Blythe's left cheek, tearing the pale skin and drawing thick ribbons of dark blood. Blythe shrieked in pain, stumbling backward. "Grab her, Iggy! Grab her throat!" Blythe screamed, blood pouring down her neck, staining her pristine floral collar. Ignacio dropped his precious microphone. The heavy metal casing hit the floor with a loud crack, shattering the delicate internal ribbon. He lunged at the girl, his large hands clamping down on her windpipe. But Rosie wasn't finished. As Ignacio pinned her to the floor, strangling the life out of her in a brutal, ugly struggle that had absolutely no artistic value, Rosie's frantic hands grabbed blindly at his chest. Her fingers hooked onto the heavy, custom-made silver pendant hanging from Ignacio's neck, a medallion of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of musicians. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Rosie yanked. The thick silver chain snapped. The heavy pendant flew from Ignacio's neck and clattered against the baseboards, rolling underneath a raised acoustic foam panel in the dark corner of the hallway. A minute later, the terrible, chaotic thrashing stopped. Rosie's eyes went glassy. Her chest stopped heaving. The only sound left in the station was Ignacio and Blythe's ragged, exhausted breathing. There was no beautiful recording. There was only a bruised, battered corpse, a smashed microphone, and a massive mess. "Look at my face." Blythe sobbed, pressing a trembling hand against her bleeding cheek. "She ruined my face." "Shut up, Blythe. Just shut up." Ignacio hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. This wasn't art. This was murder. And it was sloppy. They couldn't afford their usual methodical perfection. They dragged Rosie's limp body by the ankles, leaving a smear of coffee and blood on the linoleum, pulling her into the unfinished utility closet behind the main transmission rack. Working in a blind panic, they stuffed her between the cinderblock foundation and the interior drywall. They didn't bother wrapping her in plastic. They just piled fiberglass insulation over her face and violently nailed the heavy drywall panels shut, covering the fresh nail heads with a coat of quick-drying plaster. They spent the next 3 hours scrubbing the hallway floor with bleach, burning Rosie's coat, and tossing her bicycle into the deep, churning waters of the cove at the bottom of the hill. By dawn, the radio station looked spotless. Blythe had bandaged her face, blaming the deep scratches on a stray feral cat she had tried to feed. Ignacio had glued the casing of his microphone back together. They sat in the control room, drinking cold coffee, convincing themselves that they had survived their first mistake. But in the dark hallway, hidden deep beneath the edge of the black acoustic panel, resting in a dried, sticky puddle of spilled coffee and Rosemary Callahan's blood, lay the silver face of Saint Cecilia, waiting to be found. Saturday morning in Blythe's Cove tasted like cold salt and stale fry grease. At 6 a.m., the flickering neon sign of the Rusty Anchor Diner buzzed to life, casting a sickly yellow glow through persistent coastal drizzle. By 6:15 a.m., the fry cook was cursing at the empty waitress station. By 7:30 a.m., Marion Callahan, Rosemary's mother, was sitting in the diner's corner vinyl booth, trembling uncontrollably. Her rough, working-class hands were wrapped tightly around a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee she had no intention of drinking. Rosie had never missed a shift in 3 years. Not once. She was the kind of girl who would show up with a fever of 100 and one rather than leave her co-workers short-handed. When the diner's heavy rotary phone rang, Marion lunged for it, praying to hear her daughter's apologetic voice. It was just a wrong number. That was the exact moment the suffocating, icy panic truly set in. Small towns did not handle the disappearance of their sweethearts very well. Enter Detective Alden Crawford. Crawford had transferred to Washington State 3 years ago to escape the sprawling, neon-soaked bloodbaths of Chicago. He was a man deeply tired of his own profession, 52 years old, carrying an extra 20 pounds of bad diner food around his midsection, and sporting a perpetually ruined left knee from a shootout he barely remembered. Crawford wanted a quiet desk. He wanted a pension. He wanted a jurisdiction where the most pressing criminal emergency was teenagers siphoning gasoline from tractors. When the local precinct's dispatcher handed him the missing person report for a 19-year-old girl, the familiar, dark knot of dread tightened in his gut. Crawford knew the grim mathematics of police work. In Chicago, if a girl went missing for more than 12 hours, you stopped looking for a runaway and started looking for a shallow grave. Crawford drove his unmarked, olive green 1961 Plymouth Belvedere to the Callahan residence, a small, weather-beaten house smelling of dried lavender and damp wood. Marion Callahan was frantic, pacing the narrow living room, sobbing and insisting that Rosie must have gotten lost in the thick fog the night before, or perhaps fallen off the pier. Crawford let the mother talk while he methodically went to work, tearing apart the girl's bedroom with practiced, clinical precision. He wasn't looking for a tragic accident. He was looking for intent. He didn't find the romantic, spontaneous escape Marion was secretly hoping for. He found the exact opposite. Under the perfectly made twin bed, he found a heavy glass mason jar stuffed to the brim with wrinkled $1 bills and rolled quarters, Rosie's fiercely guarded college fund. Her battered leather suitcase was gathering dust on the top shelf of the closet. Her favorite blue wool peacoat was missing, which made sense for a rainy night. But her toothbrush, her tortoiseshell hairbrush, and a half-finished knitting project were all sitting exactly where they belonged. On her wooden vanity, a diary lay open. The last entry was entirely mundane. A quick note about taking an extra evening shift to pay for new winter boots, and a reminder to pick up a sack of flour for the diner's pie crusts. "She didn't run away, Mrs. Callahan," Crawford said, stepping back into the living room. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, worn down by decades of cheap cigarettes, offering absolutely no false comfort. Girls who run away take their money. They take their bags. And they don't leave their diaries open on the desk. Rosie fully intended to come home last night. By noon, the quiet, isolated coastal town had transformed into an anxious, buzzing hive. The local police force, consisting of Crawford, the aging chief, and 4 deputies, organized a massive search party. Dozens of local fishermen, burly loggers, and concerned shopkeepers trudged through the dense, rain-soaked pine forests and scoured the muddy banks of the estuary. The thick fog from the previous night had lifted, replaced by a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked the volunteers to the bone and turned the forest floor into a slippery trap. Crawford hated civilian search parties. While well-intentioned, they destroyed delicate evidence, trampled fresh tire tracks, and muddied crucial timelines. Leaving the volunteers to comb the eastern woods, Crawford drove his Plymouth toward the northern edge of town, where the coastal bluffs rose sharply and violently against the gray, churning Pacific. According to the diner's cook, Rosie had left on her bicycle around 11 p.m. to deliver a late-night order. Crawford slowly drove his car along the winding coastal highway, his eyes scanning the steep ditches. He parked at the base of the steep, winding gravel access road that led up a massive hill. At the top of that hill stood the towering, red-blinking transmission antenna of KB-COVE. Crawford popped the trunk of his Plymouth, grabbed a heavy brass flashlight, and began walking along the jagged, slippery embankment where gravel road met the turbulent ocean. Ignacio and Blythe Vargas had made a critical, arrogant miscalculation in their panic the night before. When they had violently thrown the bicycle into the dark waters of the cove, they hadn't accounted for the jagged basalt rocks protruding just below the surface at low tide, nor the sheer, tangled strength of the dense coastal kelp beds. The heavy iron frame of the bicycle hadn't sunk into the deep, silent abyss. It had caught on the rocks, held tightly in the unforgiving grip of the seaweeds. Crawford was 100 yards down the rocky shoreline, the freezing surf crashing violently against his leather boots, when the beam of his flashlight caught an unnatural flash of chrome, reflecting the dull gray daylight. He slid down the muddy embankment, his bad knee screaming with sharp spike of white-hot pain, his heavy trench coat instantly soaked in the freezing brine. Wedged tightly between 2 massive, barnacle-encrusted boulders, half submerged in the foaming surf, was a baby blue Schwinn bicycle. The front tire was badly warped, the spokes bent outward from the brutal impact of the fall. Tied securely to the back rack was a metal wire basket. Tangled in the wire was a soggy, ruined, grease-stained paper bag bearing the faded logo of the rusty anchor. Crawford stood knee-deep in the freezing water, the coastal wind whipping his gray hair across his forehead. He looked down at the ruined, empty bicycle, the icy water washing over the pedals. Then he slowly tilted his head back, tracing the steep, treacherous drop of the cliffside. His eyes followed the jagged rocks all the way up to the top of the towering bluff. Perched at the very summit, half shrouded in the afternoon mist, the brutalist concrete structure of the KB-COVE radio station sat like a fortress. The red warning lights of the antenna blinked in a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. Crawford pulled a crushed pack of Lucky Strikes from his damp pocket, managed to light one against the howling wind with a Zippo, and took a long, slow drag. The quiet retirement he had been desperately hoping for was officially over. A girl was gone. Her bicycle had been tossed off a sheer cliff, and the only thing sitting at the top of that drop was a concrete building filled with soundproof rooms. "All right, Chicago," Crawford muttered to himself, the cigarette bouncing between his lips as he stared up at the radio tower. "Let's go listen to the radio." While Detective Alden Crawford was standing knee-deep in the freezing Pacific surf, staring up at the radio tower, 16-year-old Leo Hodges was sitting in his bedroom on the other side of Blythe's Cove, staring at a phosphor-green oscilloscope. Leo was not a typical teenager. While his classmates were obsessed with varsity football and sneaking beers on the bleachers, Leo was an audiophile and an amateur ham radio operator. His cramped bedroom smelled permanently of melting rosin core solder and the warm, dusty ozone of glass vacuum tubes. His desk was a chaotic mountain of tangled copper wires, heavy amplifiers, and a prized, bulky woolen sack reel-to-reel tape recorder he had bought from a pawn shop in Seattle. For the past year, Leo had made a habit of recording Ignacio Vargas's midnight jazz broadcasts on KB-COVE. It wasn't just about the music. It was about the unparalleled acoustic fidelity. Ignacio was a master of his craft. The way he balanced the low frequencies of a stand-up bass with the crisp snap of a snare drum was nothing short of brilliant. Leo recorded the shows to study the mixing techniques. It was Saturday evening. The town was still buzzing with the frantic, organized chaos of the search for Rosemary Callahan. Leo, however, had spent the day grounded by his parents, confined his room due to a failing grade in algebra. To pass the time, he threaded the thick magnetic tape from Friday night's broadcast, the night Rosemary vanished, into the woolen sack and hit play. Right away, Leo noticed something was profoundly wrong. He knew Ignacio's rhythm. He knew the velvet, hypnotic cadence of the man's voice. But on Friday night's tape, Ignacio had sounded completely different. The smooth transitions were gone. At exactly 11:42 p.m., there had been a sudden, jarring 30 seconds of dead air, followed by Ignacio's voice returning with a subtle, unmistakable tremor. He had sounded out of breath, panicked, and then came the music. Ignacio had queued up a 20-minute, experimental Miles Davis track. But underneath the lonely wail of the trumpet, Leo heard a strange, rhythmic distortion. It sounded like a heavy, industrial machine grinding against wet concrete. A low, droning rumble that vibrated the small speakers on Leo's desk. Ignacio never allowed dirty audio on his broadcasts. He was a perfectionist who constantly bragged about his clean signal. Frowning, Leo leaned closer to the speakers. He rewound the tape. He listened again. The static wasn't random. It had a strange, organic cadence to it. It rose and fell in unnatural waves. Leo's hands flew over his equipment. He patched the audio output from the tape deck directly into a custom-built graphic equalizer he had soldered together himself. He killed the high and mid-range frequencies, entirely erasing the jazz trumpet and the snare drums from the mix, isolating only the low, rumbling distortion underneath. He played it again. It was just a slow, monstrous groan. Then, a chilling thought struck the young audiophile. What if it isn't static? What if it's just slow? When you record audio at a high speed, say 15 inches per second, and play it back at a standard 3 3/4 inches per second, a human voice transforms into a sluggish, demonic growl. Ignacio had the best equipment in the county. If he wanted to hide something in plain sight, stretching the audio was the easiest way to do it. Leo's fingers were trembling slightly as he adjusted the drive belt on his woolen sack tape deck. He cranked the playback speed up to maximum. The heavy plastic spools whirred into a frantic, high-speed blur. He hit the playback button. The low, monstrous groan was instantly pitched up, snapping violently into its original frequency. The sound that exploded from Leo's bedroom speakers made his blood run absolutely cold. It wasn't an industrial machine. It wasn't static. It was a human voice. What did you do? The scream was raw, echoing and saturated with an unimaginable, visceral terror. It was followed by the unmistakable sounds of a violent physical struggle, a heavy thud, the sharp scrape of shoes against linoleum, a muffled gasp, and a sickening, wet tearing sound. Then dead air. Leo fell backward off his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew that voice. Everyone in Blythe's Cove knew that bright, melodic voice. She had served him a vanilla milkshake at the Rusty Anchor just 3 days ago. It was Rosemary Callahan. Ignacio Vargas hadn't just broadcasted a jazz record on Friday night. In his arrogant, twisted panic to cover up the sounds of the brutal struggle in his hallway, he had taken the raw, ambient recording of Rosie's desperate fight for her life, slowed it down into an unrecognizable ambient drone, and played it underneath the music. The entire town had been searching for the missing girl in the woods, completely unaware that her final, terrifying moments had been pumped directly into their living rooms. Leo didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of his bedroom, clutching his knees to his chest, staring in absolute horror at the spinning spools of magnetic tape. By 7 a.m. on Sunday morning, the rain was pouring down in heavy, relentless sheets. The Blythe's Cove Police Precinct was a chaotic mess of wet jackets, muddy boots, and exhausted volunteers drinking terrible coffee. Detective Alden Crawford was sitting at his cluttered desk, rubbing his bloodshot eyes, staring at a topographic map of the coastal cliffs where he had found the bicycle. The heavy glass doors of the precinct pushed open. Leo Hodges walked in. He was pale, soaking wet from the rain, and shivering violently. He bypassed confused desk sergeant entirely, carrying a heavy, gray canvas bag containing his portable tape recorder. Leo walked straight up to Crawford's desk and slammed the heavy machine down onto the topographical map. "Son, this is an active investigation," Crawford growled, his voice thick with fatigue, annoyed by the intrusion. "You need to wait in the lobby." "You're looking for Rosie in the woods," Leo said, his voice cracking, tears mixing with the rainwater on his cheeks. "She's not in the woods, detective. She's on the radio." Crawford stopped rubbing his eyes. He looked at the trembling teenager, then looked down at the reel-to-reel tape deck. The seasoned detective in him, the Chicago cop who had seen the darkest, most twisted corners of human depravity, felt a sudden, icy chill crawl up his spine. "Show me," Crawford said softly. Leo plugged the machine into the wall outlet. He threaded the tape, adjusted the speed, and pressed play. In the middle of the crowded, noisy police precinct, the raw, unedited audio of Rosemary Callahan's final, terrified scream cut through the room like a jagged knife. "What did you do?" The sound of the struggle followed, brutal and undeniable. The precinct went dead silent. Every deputy, every volunteer stopped moving. Crawford stood up slowly. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together in his mind. The missing girl, the bicycle abandoned at the bottom of the cliff, the radio station perched like a concrete gargoyle at the very top. The killer wasn't just dumping bodies. He was broadcasting his trophies. The drive up to the KB-COVE broadcast tower felt like ascending into an isolation chamber. Detective Alden Crawford's heavy Plymouth Belvedere groaned as its tires chewed through the steep, muddy gravel of the access road. The torrential rain of the morning had finally surrendered to a thick, suffocating marine layer that clung to the pine trees like wet cotton. By the time Crawford parked in a small asphalt lot, the radio station loomed before him. A windowless, brutalist block of poured concrete and steel, crowned by the pulsing red eye of the transmission antenna. It didn't look like a place of entertainment. It looked like a bunker. Crawford killed the engine, popped a fresh peppermint life-saver into his mouth to mask the scent of stale tobacco, and stepped out into the freezing fog. He adjusted his heavy trench coat, letting his right hand brush instinctively against the cold steel of his .38 caliber revolver holstered at his hip. He didn't have a warrant yet. A garbled audio tape brought in by a grounded teenager wasn't enough to tear down the walls of the town's most beloved local celebrity. He needed probable cause. He needed to smell the blood. He pushed through the heavy, reinforced glass doors of the lobby. The transition from a howling coastal wind to the interior of the station was jarring. The silence inside was immediate, absolute, and unnatural. "Can I help you, officer?" The voice was soft, melodic, and perfectly pitched to convey helpful innocence. Blythe Vargas stood behind the mahogany reception desk. She was wearing a high-collared, burgundy wool sweater and a meticulously iron pleated skirt. Her blonde hair was pinned back with a tortoiseshell clip, but Crawford's trained, predatory eyes bypassed the wholesome attire and instantly locked onto the side of her face. A stark white, rectangular bandage was plastered across her left cheek, stretching from her cheekbone down to her jawline. "Detective Alden Crawford," he said, flashing his golden shield. "I'm leading the search for Rosemary Callahan. I'm just doing routine canvass of the area. Mrs. Vargas, tracing the girl's last known steps." "Oh, it's just awful about little Rosie," Blythe whispered, her eyes widening with rehearsed maternal concern. She stepped out from behind the desk, wringing her pale hands together. "We've been praying for her safe return all weekend. Ignacio mentioned it on his broadcast last night. Please come back to the studio lounge. I'll make us some coffee." "I'm fine, thank you," Crawford rumbled, his boots sinking into the thick, sound-dampening carpet as he followed her down the dim, wood-panel hallway. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop by 10 degrees, and then Crawford hit the invisible wall. It was a smell. To an ordinary civilian, it was merely an aggressive, cloying wave of cheap, artificial pine-scented aerosol air freshener mixed with industrial-strength lemon bleach. But Crawford wasn't civilian. He had spent 20 years working homicides in the slaughterhouse heat of Chicago summers. Beneath the chemical pine and the sharp, stinging citrus of the bleach, his olfactory nerves caught a distinct, terrible undercurrent. It was a faint, sickly sweet scent, the unmistakable, coppery aroma of dried blood, mixed with the early, rotting bloom of decaying organic matter and a harsh chemical tang that smelled suspiciously like medical-grade formaldehyde. His stomach tightened. The tape was real. They had killed her right here in this hallway. "Ignacio!" Blythe called out softly, opening the heavy, acoustic-padded door to the main control room. "Detective Crawford is here to ask about Rosie." Ignacio Vargas spun his leather chair away from the massive mixing console. He looked exactly like his voice sounded, smooth, tailored, and entirely unbothered. He wore a dark charcoal turtleneck sweater that climbed high up his neck, completely covering his throat. Crawford noted the sartorial choice. A turtleneck was a great way to hide defensive strangulation bruises or a broken necklace chain. "Detective," Ignacio said warmly, extending a manicured hand. "A terrible business. How can we be of assistance?" Crawford didn't shake the hand. He merely pulled a small leather notepad from his breast pocket, clicking his pen. "The diner's cook says Rosie rode her bicycle up here around 11 o'clock on Friday night with a delivery," Crawford said, his voice flat, devoid of any conversational warmth. "Did she make it to the station?" "She did." Ignacio nodded, his expression shifting to one of solemn gravity. "Arrived right on time. Poor girl looked exhausted, soaked to the bone from the fog. She dropped off a cherry pie and a thermos of coffee. I tipped her $2. She thanked me, and she rode right back down the hill." "Did she come inside the building?" Crawford asked, taking a slow step forward, his eyes darting toward the pristine, freshly scrubbed linoleum near the baseboards. "Just the lobby," Blythe chimed in quickly. Too quickly. Just for a moment to get out of the damp. Crawford slowly turned his gaze back to Blythe. He let the silence hang in the air for a deeply uncomfortable 5 seconds. He stared directly at the bandage on her cheek. "Nasty scrape you got there, Mrs. Vargas," Crawford finally noted, gesturing with the tip of his pen. "Looks fresh. And deep." Blythe's hand instinctively fluttered to her face, a nervous reflex she immediately tried to suppress. "Oh, this? It's so silly. I was trying to feed a stray tabby cat out by the dumpsters on Saturday morning. It got spooked and lashed out, claws like razor blades." Crawford leaned in just a fraction of an inch. "A cat, huh? Funny thing about feline scratches, Mrs. Vargas. They usually run parallel. Clean, shallow, narrow lines. Yours looks more like a gouge. Broad, jagged, like somebody was fighting for their life and dug their fingernails in as hard as they could to tear the skin away." The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. The pleasant, cooperative facade shattered. Ignacio's jaw muscles twitched violently beneath his dark skin. Blythe's pale complexion turned the color of old chalk, her eyes widening not in fake concern, but in raw, naked alarm. "Are you accusing my wife of something, detective?" Ignacio's voice had lost its velvet warmth. It was now a cold, metallic hiss. "Just an observation from an old Chicago cop who's seen a lot of defensive wounds," Crawford replied smoothly, pocketing his notepad. He turned his head, looking at the thick, fabric-covered acoustic panels lining the walls of the studio. He reached out and tapped the wall with his knuckles. It produced a dull, heavy, sickeningly solid thud. "Incredible soundproofing you have in here, Mr. Vargas," Crawford murmured, his back turned to the killers. "Thick walls. You could scream until your vocal cords snapped in half in a room like this, and a man walking his dog 10 feet outside the door wouldn't hear a single note." Crawford turned back around. Ignacio was standing up, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes burning with a venomous, panicked hatred. Blythe had taken a step backward, pressing herself against the doorframe. "I think we're done here, detective," Ignacio stated coldly. "Unless you have a warrant." "No warrant," Crawford smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "Not yet, but I've got a feeling I'll be listening to your broadcast tonight. Ignacio, pay close attention to the frequencies. Have a nice afternoon." Crawford walked out of the studio, marched down the hallway reeking of bleach and death, and stepped back out into the freezing fog. He didn't just suspect them anymore. He knew. Now he just had to tear those walls down. Detective Alden Crawford did not sleep on Sunday night. He sat at his battered metal desk at the Blythe-COVE precinct, surrounded by a fog of blue cigarette smoke and lukewarm coffee, building a cage of paper and facts around Ignacio and Blythe Vargas. Intuition of fresh scratch and the smell of bleach were enough to convince an old Chicago cop, but they weren't nearly enough to convince a Superior Court judge to authorize a raid on the town's most prominent media figure. Crawford needed concrete, undeniable evidence. He needed the weapon, and he needed the location verified. He started with the wife. At 8 a.m. on Monday, Crawford was standing in the immaculate, sterile waiting room of Dr. William Henderson, the only dental surgeon in a 50-mile radius. Henderson was a nervous, balding man in his late 60s whose hands had developed a slight, persistent tremor. "Blythe?" "Oh, Blythe was a wonderful assistant," Dr. Henderson stammered, wiping his spectacles on his white coat when Crawford flashed his badge. "Quiet. Meticulous. She left about 8 months ago to help her husband full-time at the radio station. Why on earth are you asking about her in relation to the Callahan girl?" Crawford didn't offer a polite preamble. "Doctor, I need to see your controlled substance inventory logs. Specifically, I'm looking for discrepancies in your surgical sedatives and paralytics." Henderson's face flushed a deep, guilty crimson. In small towns, sloppy record-keeping was a common sin. He led Crawford to a locked filing cabinet in the back office. As they pored over the handwritten ledgers, Crawford's thick fingers stopped on a series of entries from the previous year. Succinylcholine chloride. Crawford read the complex chemical name aloud, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It's a powerful neuromuscular blocker, used for severe jaw surgeries to prevent muscle spasms. You have 3 entire boxes completely unaccounted for. Doctor, enough to paralyze a football team." I assumed it was a shipping error," Henderson whispered, shrinking under Crawford's piercing glare. "Or that I had miscounted. Blythe was the one who handled the inventory deliveries. She had the keys to the cabinet. Means and opportunity. Crawford had his murder weapon. Blythe hadn't just been supporting her husband. She was the procurer. But the stolen drugs still didn't tie the Vargas couple directly to Rosemary Callahan's disappearance. For that, Crawford needed the tape. By noon, Crawford had driven to the torrential coastal rain, to the State Police Crime Laboratory in Seattle. He carried young Leo Hodges' Woollensack reel-to-reel tape deck, like it was a live bomb. He met with Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic acoustic specialist who had been pioneering a brand-new, cutting-edge technology for the FBI called voice print analysis. Thorne's laboratory looked like the bridge of a spaceship. It was lined with towering racks of oscilloscopes, frequency analyzers, and a massive Bell Laboratories sound spectrograph. Crawford played the tape. The agonizing, slowed-down distortion of Rosie's scream echoed through the sterile lab. Thorne immediately went to work, his face grim and pale. He isolated the frequency, sped it up to its natural pitch, and fed the raw audio signal into the spectrograph. A mechanical stylus began burning a visual representation of sound onto a rotating drum of specially treated paper. Dark, jagged peaks and valleys formed a topographical map of a dying girl's terror. Thorne placed a known recording of Rosemary Callahan, a cheerful radio interview she had done for a high school bake sale a year prior, into the machine and printed a second graph. He placed the two strips of paper side by side under a bright magnifying lamp. "Look here, Alden," Dr. Thorne said, pointing to the distinct, dark horizontal bands on the paper. "These are formants, the unique resonant frequencies of a human vocal tract. They are as individual as fingerprints. The pitch is elevated due to extreme physiological stress and terror, but the fundamental vocal signature is an absolute match. The girl screaming on this broadcast is undeniably Rosemary Callahan." Crawford let out a long, slow breath. "Can you prove where she was when she screamed?" "I can." Thorne nodded, tapping a second graph. "Listen to the background of the audio. Or rather, listen to what isn't there. When a person screams in a forest, the sound waves bounce off trees, creating a complex echo. When they scream in a house, the sound bounces off glass windows and wooden floors. It creates a subtle reverberation tail. But this scream," Thorne pointed to the sudden, sharp drop-off on the paper. "There is zero reverberation. The sound wave is absorbed instantly. The ambient noise floor is practically a vacuum. Alden, this girl was fighting for her life inside a perfectly soundproof environment, an anechoic chamber. An anechoic chamber, like a broadcast studio lined with thick, heavy acoustic foam." It was 9:30 p.m. when Detective Crawford aggressively knocked on the heavy mahogany door of Judge Arthur Belmont's private residence. He didn't care that the judge was already in his pajamas, sipping a glass of scotch by the fireplace. Crawford spread the evidence across the judge's expensive Persian rug. He laid down the photographs of the abandoned bicycle, the dental clinic's missing inventory logs showing the stolen paralytics, the visual spectrograph prints confirming Rosie's voice, and his own sworn affidavit regarding the deep, defensive lacerations on Blythe Vargas's face and the overpowering smell of bleach and decay in the studio hallway. "They're killing people, Arthur," Crawford growled, his voice vibrating with absolute certainty. "They paralyzed her. They murdered her in that hallway, and that sick son of a bitch broadcasted her dying moments over the airwaves. I need a sledgehammer, and I need a warrant. Tonight." Judge Belmont stared at the spectrograph paper, the blood draining from his weathered face. He had listened to KB-COVE for years. The realization of what he had been tapping his foot to made him physically nauseous. He set his scotch glass down with a trembling hand, picked up his fountain pen, and signed his name with a heavy, forceful stroke across the bottom of the search warrant. "Tear the walls down, Alden," the judge whispered. "Tear them all down." Crawford pocketed the warrant. The hunt was over. It was time for the execution. Midnight. The rain had returned, a torrential Pacific Northwest downpour that turned the steep gravel access road into a river of dark, treacherous mud. A convoy of 4 Plymouth police cruisers, their headlights cutting through the blinding rain, crawled up the massive hill toward the towering red antenna of KB-COVE. They drove without sirens. Detective Alden Crawford wanted the element of absolute, terrifying surprise. He sat in the passenger seat of the lead car, holding a heavy steel crowbar across his lap, his jaw set like a stone vault. Inside the heavily soundproof broadcast booth, Ignacio Vargas was completely oblivious to the approaching armada. He was halfway through his midnight jazz segment, his velvety baritone purring into a freshly repaired RCA microphone. Blythe sat on her usual vinyl couch, her bandaged face pale under the dim studio lights, nervously picking at the fabric of her pleated skirt. The paranoia from Crawford's visit had poisoned their sanctuary. The silence in the room felt heavy, brittle, and ready to shatter. It shattered with the explosive, deafening crack of a heavy police battering ram splintering the thick oak doors of the front lobby. Ignacio violently flinched, ripping his headphones off his ears. The premium soundproofing muffled the initial breach, but the aggressive, rhythmic thud of dozens of heavy police boots storming down the linoleum hallway vibrated directly through the floorboards. Iggy! Blythe shrieked, leaping from the couch, her eyes wide with feral, uncontrolled panic. They're here! The police are here! The cultured, artistic arrogance completely evaporated from Ignacio's face, replaced by raw, ugly terror. The tapes! We have to destroy the master tapes. He scrambled toward the massive archive cabinet, frantically pulling down heavy spools of magnetic tape. He grabbed a bulk tape eraser, a heavy, handheld electromagnet designed to wipe audio reels clean in seconds. He plugged it in, the machine humming with a vicious electrical vibration, and began desperately waving it over the boxes of recorded murders, trying to erase the agonizing final breaths of Elijah, Tommy, and Clara. Blythe threw her entire body weight against the heavy, acoustic padded studio door, trying to slide the brass deadbolt into place. She wasn't fast enough. Crawford didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door with the full, brutal force of his ruined left knee. The heavy was slammed inward, throwing Blythe backward onto the carpet. 3 uniformed deputies flooded into the control room with their .38 service weapons drawn and leveled. Step away from the console. Get your hands in the air. Crawford roared, his voice louder than any radio broadcast, filling the room with terrifying authority. Ignacio hesitated, clutching a reel of tape to his chest, his eyes darting wildly. A deputy lunged forward, tackling the sound engineer hard to the floor. The heavy electromagnet clattered from his grip, sparking dangerously against a metal chair leg. Blythe was screaming a high, piercing wail of defeat as another deputy roughly cuffed her hands behind her back, pressing her bruised face into the carpet. You have no right. Ignacio spat, blood pooling in his mouth from a split lip, his bespoke turtleneck ruined as he was pinned down. This is a private broadcast. You are trespassing. Crawford slowly walked into the room, his soaking wet trench coat dripping rainwater onto the pristine floor. He pulled the folded search warrant from his breast pocket and dropped it directly onto Ignacio's heaving chest. I'm taking your station off the air, Ignacio, Crawford growled. He turned to the open hallway and shouted over the chaos. Bring in the dogs! 2K, 9 handlers entered the building, leading German shepherds on short, tight leashes. These weren't standard patrol dogs. They were cadaver dogs, trained specifically to locate the chemical gases emitted by decaying human tissue. The moment the dogs crossed the threshold into the dimly lit hallway, they went absolutely berserk. But they didn't sniff the floor. They didn't sniff the furniture. The dogs lunged aggressively toward the walls. One shepherd reared up on its hind legs, viciously scratching at the dark, porous acoustic paneling right outside Studio B, barking with frantic, deafening intensity. The other dog bolted down the corridor, stopping precisely at the freshly plastered section of drywall near the utility closet, whining and digging its sharp claws into the baseboards. Crawford watched the dogs, a cold, sickening not tightening in his stomach. He looked down at Ignacio, whose defiant sneer had suddenly melted into a mask of pure, catatonic dread. Hand me the crowbar, Crawford ordered a deputy. The detective stepped up to the wall outside Studio B. He swung the heavy steel bar with brutal, practiced violence. The thick acoustic foam tore away. The drywall beneath it shattered in a cloud of choking white dust. Crawford swung again and again, breaking through the wooden studs. A wave of putrid, suffocating air spilled out of the dark cavity. Several deputies gagged, stumbling backward and covering their mouths. The smell of aerosol pine and bleach was completely obliterated by the overwhelming, sickening stench of rotting flesh. Crawford aimed his heavy brass flashlight into the hole. Wedged tightly between the fiberglass insulation and the exterior brick, bound with industrial wire, was a mummified human face. Its jaw was locked in an eternal, paralyzed scream. It was the insurance salesman, Elijah. "Dear God," a deputy whispered, crossing himself in the hallway. "Keep swinging," Crawford commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and furious vindication. "Tear every damn wall in this building open." For the next hour, the radio station was systematically disassembled. It became a macabre archaeological dig. Behind the mixing desk in Studio A, they found the rotting remains of the young mechanic, Tommy. Behind the vocal booth, they pulled out the fragile, decomposing body of the music teacher, Clara Higgins. The legendary, pristine acoustics of KB-COVE were literally built on a foundation of human corpses. Finally, Crawford stood before the utility closet. This was the fresh plaster, the hurried job. He took a heavy sledgehammer and smashed a massive, jagged hole through the wall. There was no plastic wrapping here, no careful preservation. Resting in a horrific, tangled heap amidst the pink fiberglass insulation was Rosemary Callahan. Her blue diner uniform was stiff with dried blood. Her bright, beautiful face was battered, her neck covered in deep, purple contusions from Ignacio's desperate strangulation. Crawford gently reached his gloved hand into the dusty cavity. He brushed away the insulation from the girl's stiff, rigid fingers. Clutched tightly in Rosie's dead hand, a final, fierce act of defiance from a girl fighting for her life, was a torn, blood-soaked scrap of pale yellow floral fabric. It was a perfect, undeniable match for the dress Blythe Vargas had been wearing on the night of the murder. And resting in the dried pool of coffee and blood at the bottom of the wall cavity, catching the beam of Crawford's flashlight with a damning, metallic gleam, was a heavy silver medallion. The face of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of musicians, stared blindly up at the detective. Crawford picked up the silver pendant with a pair of tweezers and dropped it into a clear evidence bag. He walked slowly back into the main control room. Ignacio and Blythe were sitting on the floor, handcuffed, completely silent. The terrifying, inescapable reality of their monstrous arrogance had finally collapsed upon them. Crawford held up the plastic evidence bag, letting the bloody silver pendant swing like a pendulum under the bright studio lights. "You were right about one thing, Ignacio," Crawford said softly, his voice echoing in the ruined, torn-up room. "Death has a sound. And tonight, it sounds exactly like a pair of handcuffs." The trial of Ignacio and Blythe Vargas began in the sweltering early summer of 1965. The Grays Harbor County Courthouse, a grand, limestone building smelling perpetually of lemon wax and old paper, became the epicenter of a national media circus. Reporters from New York to Los Angeles crammed into the wooden pews, their flashbulbs popping like violent bursts of static. But inside the humid, claustrophobic courtroom, the atmosphere wasn't electric. It was suffocatingly heavy. It was a room waiting for a ghost to speak. The prosecution's case, meticulously built by Detective Alden Crawford, was a devastating avalanche of physical evidence. There were the stolen medical vials of succinylcholine. There was a heavy silver medallion of Saint Cecilia, pulled from the dried blood in the wall cavity. There were the horrific, glossy crime scene photographs of the 4 mummified bodies, violently extracted from the soundproof tomb of KB-COVE. But the turning point of the trial, the moment that cemented the Vargas couple's fate, was not a photograph. It was a sound. On the 8th day of the trial, the prosecution wheeled a massive, military-grade woolen sack reel-to-reel tape deck into the center of the courtroom, hooking it up to a pair of heavy studio monitors. The judge, a stern man with deeply lined features, warned the gallery that the audio they were about to hear was profoundly disturbing. They played the master tapes, unedited, unslowed. For 45 agonizing minutes, the packed courtroom was subjected to the raw, unvarnished reality of Ignacio's art. They listened to the wet, desperate struggling of Elijah Vance. They heard the frantic, chaotic thrashing of young Tommy. They sat in absolute, paralyzed horror as Clara Higgins's high, thin, whistling death rattle echoed off the high plaster ceilings of the courthouse. Several jurors openly wept into their handkerchiefs. A reporter in the second row stood up, violently nauseous, and rushed out the heavy oak doors. Through it all, Blythe Vargas sat at the defense table, a hollow, trembling shell of a woman. Her blonde hair had lost its luster, and her pale hands shook uncontrollably. The maternal, innocent facade had been entirely burned away, leaving only a terrified, broken accomplice. Ignacio, however, was a completely different story. He sat perfectly upright in his tailored suit, his dark eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to the side. He wasn't listening to the weeping of the victims' families in the gallery. He was listening to the acoustic fidelity of the playback. He was admiring his own engineering. He was entirely, irredeemably monstrous. When the raw audio of Rosemary Callahan's final, terrified scream, "What did you do?" tore through the speakers. Mary and Callahan collapsed into Detective Crawford's arms in the front row, sobbing uncontrollably. Crawford didn't look at the grieving mother. His cold, hard eyes were locked entirely on Ignacio. The jury took less than 2 hours to deliberate. They found Ignacio and Blythe Vargas guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge didn't hesitate. He sentenced them both to die. 16 months later, on a freezing, rain-swept night in November of 1966, the state penitentiary prepared to execute the sentence. Blythe went first. The terrified, weeping woman had to be physically dragged by 2 heavy-set guards down the long, green-tiled corridor of death row. She begged for her life, blaming Ignacio for the madness, her soft, apologetic voice finally cracking into an ugly, desperate shriek. But there was no mercy to be found in the cold, cinder-block execution chamber. An hour later, it was Ignacio's turn. He didn't fight the guards. He walked with strange, dark dignity, his head shaved completely bald, the right leg of his prison-issue trousers slit to the knee. He was led into the brightly lit chamber. In the center of the room, bolted firmly to the concrete floor, sat the heavy oak electric chair. It was a brutal, ugly piece of machinery, a crude instrument of death that possessed absolutely no artistic value. The guards forced him into the chair, violently pulling the thick, leather straps tight across his chest, his forearms, and his ankles. The heavy brass buckles clicked and locked into place with a cold, metallic finality. Ignacio stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the thick, reinforced glass window of the observation room. Standing in the back row, his arms crossed over his heavy trench coat, was Detective Alden Crawford. The old Chicago cop didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. He offered Ignacio a slow, grim nod, an acknowledgement of the end. The executioner stepped forward. He placed a heavy natural sea sponge, soaking wet with highly conductive saline solution, directly onto the shaved crown of Ignacio's head. Then came the heavy leather mask, strapped tightly over his face, leaving only his chin and mouth exposed. Finally, the heavy copper electrode was clamped securely to his bare right calf. The room fell into an absolute, sterile silence. It reminded Ignacio of the broadcast booth. The warden stepped up the wall, holding a red telephone. He checked his watch. It was exactly 2:13 a.m. "Proceed," the warden whispered. The executioner pulled the heavy steel lever on the wall panel. Behind the wall, the massive industrial generators violently roared to life. This was the one sound Ignacio Vargas had never recorded. It was a raw, unrefined, and terrifyingly powerful frequency, 60 hertz of alternating current. Over 2,000 volts of raw electricity surged through the heavy copper cables, slamming into Ignacio's body with the force of a freight train. His body violently seized, surging upward against the heavy leather straps. His muscles clamped down in a state of absolute, unbreakable tetanus. Smoke began to curl out from underneath the wet sponge, filling the small execution chamber with a horrific, sweet and sour scent of burning hair and ozone. Ignacio's lungs violently contracted, forcing the last reserve of air out through his paralyzed throat. It wasn't a velvet baritone. It wasn't a beautiful, artistic sigh. It was just a wet, ugly, mechanical hiss of a body being violently turned off. 3 minutes later, the generator whined down into silence. The state-appointed doctor stepped forward, unbuttoned Ignacio's smoking shirt, and pressed a stethoscope to his chest. He turned to the warden and nodded. The frequency was dead. The broadcast was permanently over. Miles away, in a quiet, coastal diner in Blythe's Cove, a waitress poured a cup of black coffee for a lonely truck driver. In the corner of the room, an old vacuum tube radio played a soft jazz tune. There was no static underneath the music. There was no hidden terror. There was only the quiet, peaceful hum of the Pacific night and the comforting sound of a world that had finally silenced its monsters.